The price of belonging. I still remember the exact moment I realized my place in the Morgan family wasn't what I'd spent my whole life believing it to be. It wasn't some dramatic confrontation or even a single cruel word. It was a place card. Name. The wedding coordinator's smile was professionally bright as she tapped her tablet. Ethan Morgan. I straightened the lapels of my suit, a little too stiff and a little too new. I'd splurged on it specifically for my brother Jackson's wedding. 3 months of savings from my job at the bookstore, all to look like I belonged among Boston's elite at the Four Seasons. Her smile flickered slightly as she found my name. Mr. Morgan, you're seated at. She hesitated, glancing up at me. You're at table 24. I frowned. There must be some mistake. That's not the family table. I'm sorry, sir. Her voice dropped to a whisper. This seating arrangement was approved directly by the groom and his mother. The ballroom around me blurred slightly at the edges. Table 24. Not just away from the family table. It was in the auxiliary room, separated from the main ballroom by a set of decorative partitions, where they put distant cousins and colleagues they felt obligated to invite. As I took my place card, I spotted my mother Eleanor across the room. She stood beside Jackson, fussing over his boutonniere, while his fiancée Vanessa looked on. Even from here, I could see the diamond choker at Eleanor's throat catching the light, the family heirloom she'd promised to Vanessa, completing the transformation from outsider to Morgan. Mom, I said when I reached her. I kept my voice casual. Can I talk to you for a second? Eleanor barely looked up. Ethan, darling, can't you see we're busy? The photographer wants family portraits in 5 minutes. Family portraits. The words stung more than they should have. It'll just take a second. I held up my place card. I'm seated at table 24. In the side room. Eleanor sighed. The sound practiced and elegant like everything else about her. Well, we had to prioritize close family members, Ethan. She finally met my eyes, her gaze cool. You understand. I stared at her. Close family members? I'm your son. Don't be dramatic. She adjusted Jackson's tie. It's just seating. Jackson finally acknowledged me with a smirk that said everything words couldn't. This wasn't an oversight. This was a message. Is there a problem? The deep voice behind me belonged to Calvin Morgan III. My father, though father, had always felt like too intimate a word for the man who occupied the same house, but rarely the same room. No problem, father, I said, the formality slipping out automatically. Just confirming my seating arrangement. He nodded once, dismissive. Good. Let's not create a scene. Those 7 words had been the unwritten rule of my childhood. Don't create a scene. Don't draw attention. Don't embarrass the family. The Morgan name meant something in Boston, after all. 5 generations of old money, prestigious law firms, and charitable foundations just substantial enough to get their names on university buildings, but not so generous as to actually impact their lifestyle. I had been adopted into this legacy at age 4 when my biological parents, my father's cousin and his wife, died in a sailing accident off Nantucket. A tragically appropriate end for members of the Morgan extended family. The adoption had been swift, proper, and, as I later came to understand, largely for appearances. The Morgans took care of their own, at least publicly. I stepped away, my dinner jacket suddenly too tight around my chest. As I retreated, I caught Vanessa's cold, appraising look. She'd never liked me. Perhaps sensed that I saw through her fascination with the Morgan name and fortune. Perhaps simply realized I was the family member they kept at arm's length, and there must be a reason for that. That's quite the statement they're making. I turned to find an older woman watching me with shrewd eyes. Catherine Pierce, Vanessa's grandmother. Unlike her granddaughter, Catherine had no pretensions. Old South money that had multiplied through shrewd investments rather than inheritance. She had a reputation for saying exactly what she thought. Mrs. Pierce, I nodded. Table 24, she said, eyeing my place card. Quite a distance from the head table. I shrugged, aiming for nonchalance. Apparently, that's where they seat the less essential Morgans. A smile touched her lips. Is that what they told you? They didn't have to. Catherine took a sip of her champagne. You know, Mr. Morgan, family dynamics fascinate me. especially in families like yours, where appearances are everything. She glanced toward Eleanor, who was now posing with Jackson, both of them smiling perfectly for the camera. What happens when the facade cracks, I wonder? Before I could respond, the wedding planner called for family photos, and Catherine drifted away, leaving me standing alone with my place card and the distinct feeling that she knew something I didn't. I ended up not taking my seat at table 24. Instead, I found myself wandering the hotel's ornate hallways, my footsteps muffled by plush carpeting. Music and laughter spilled from the ballroom behind me, a celebration I was nominally part of but functionally excluded from. The rejection wasn't new. I'd felt it in 1,000 small ways over 20 years. The Harvard application that was mysteriously lost when I'd mentioned applying for financial aid rather than using the Morgan name. The family vacations where I was somehow always seated at the kids' table, even at 17. The way Eleanor introduced me as our Ethan rather than my son, a linguistic distancing I'd learned to smile through. But this, the public display, the irrefutable evidence that I wasn't part of the immediate family. This was new, and it stung in a way I hadn't anticipated. I pushed through the door to the hotel bar, seeking solitude or at least anonymity. The bar was nearly empty, most guests at the reception. A single figure sat hunched at the counter, nursing what looked like scotch. Reed Pierce, Vanessa's brother. He glanced up as I approached, and something in his expression made me pause. It wasn't the typical Pierce arrogance or the dismissive politeness I'd come to expect. It was doubt, raw and uncomfortable. "Ethan," he said, nodding at the stool beside him. "Escaping the circus too?" I sat, ordering a whiskey when the bartender approached. "Something like that." Reed stared into his glass as if it held answers. "Can I ask you something? And I need you to be honest." I raised an eyebrow. "Your brother." He hesitated, then continued. "Does Jackson talk about Vanessa differently when she's not around?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications. I considered lying, family loyalty, keeping the peace. But then I remembered table 24 and my mother's dismissal, and 2 decades of being just outside the circle of belonging. "You might want to finish that drink first," I said. Reed studied me for a moment, then drained his glass in one swallow. "That bad, huh?" "I don't think Jackson knows who Vanessa really is," I said carefully. "Or maybe he does, and he just doesn't care." Reed's jaw tightened. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, but before I could respond, Catherine appeared beside us, moving with surprising stealth for a woman in her 70s. "I believe," she said, setting her phone on the bar between us, "this might answer your question." Reed picked up the phone, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief as he scrolled. I couldn't see what he was looking at, but his reaction told me enough. "What is this?" he finally asked, his voice strained. Catherine's face remained impassive. "Text messages from your sister to her friends, discussing how convenient it is to marry into the Morgan name, how Jackson is easily manipulated, how once she has access to his trust fund, she won't have to play the devoted wife anymore." She glanced at me. She's also quite descriptive about her feelings toward the extended Morgan family. My stomach twisted. I'd suspected Vanessa's motivations weren't pure, but this was worse than I'd imagined. Reed's hand clenched around the phone. "How did you get these?" "I may be old, Reed, but I'm not naive. When Vanessa started bringing home a Morgan, I did my due diligence." Catherine signaled the bartender for another round. I had hoped I was wrong. I had hoped she'd grown to genuinely care for him. "Does Jackson know?" I asked. Catherine fixed me with a penetrating look. "Not yet. But he will." The confrontation happened in one of the hotel's private lounges, neutral territory, as Catherine put it. Jackson stood with his back to the window, his perfect posture finally faltering. Eleanor and Calvin flanked him like sentries, while Vanessa stood slightly apart, her wedding gown suddenly looking like a costume rather than finery. Reed had shown Jackson the texts. All of them. The ones about the Morgan fortune, about Jackson's malleability, about her plans post-wedding. The ones where she mocked Catherine as a meddling old bat who should write checks and stay quiet. "This is ridiculous," Vanessa said, her voice high and brittle. "Those texts are taken out of context." Reed, you know how I joke around with my friends. Is that what you call it? Joking. Reed's voice was quiet but sharp. Because it reads a lot like planning. Jackson. Vanessa turned to him, her eyes wide and pleading. Baby, you know me. You know this isn't who I am. Jackson didn't respond. He was looking at his phone, scrolling through the messages Reed had forwarded to him. Each swipe of his finger seemed to drain more color from his face. Sweetheart, Eleanor stepped forward, placing a hand on Jackson's arm. Let's not be hasty. I'm sure there's an explanation. There isn't. Catherine's voice cut through the tension. My granddaughter has been playing a part. The loving fiancé, the devoted partner. But it was always about the Morgan name, the Morgan connections, the Morgan money. That's not true. Vanessa's composure cracked. Jackson, tell them. Jackson finally looked up, his expression hollow. Did you really schedule a consultation with a divorce attorney last month? The room went silent. Vanessa's face drained of color. How did you? Answer the question, Vanessa. Jackson's voice was dangerously quiet. I was just exploring my options. She took a step toward him. It's normal to be nervous before a wedding. Normal. Jackson laughed, a harsh sound I'd never heard from him before. Is it normal to talk about how you're planning to access my trust fund? Is it normal to mock my mother to your friends? Is it normal to? He stopped, his voice breaking. Is it normal to say you've never loved me? Vanessa faltered, her perfect facade crumbling. You're twisting everything. This is all being taken out of context. Eleanor stepped between them, her face set in determined lines. Jackson, darling, let's not make rash decisions. Every relationship has its challenges. I couldn't stay silent any longer. Are you serious right now? All eyes turned to me, and I realized this was probably the first time most of them had heard me speak all day. Excuse me. Eleanor's tone was icy. Your son just found out his fiancée never loved him, was planning to divorce him after getting access to his money. And your response is, let's not be hasty. I shook my head in disbelief. Do you care about anyone in this family, or just how we look to your friends at the country club? Eleanor stiffened, her hand fluttering to her throat. Ethan, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. I stepped forward, no longer caring about creating a scene. This isn't about Jackson's happiness for you. It's about preserving appearances. It always has been. That's enough. Calvin's voice was sharp, but for once, it didn't stop me. No, it's not enough, I said, turning to him. For 20 years, I've watched you elevate image over substance, appearance over reality. And look where it's gotten us. Jackson was staring at me, something like recognition dawning in his eyes. Vanessa seized the moment to try one more appeal. Jackson, she said, reaching for his hand. Don't let them do this. Don't let them ruin what we have. Jackson pulled away from her touch. What exactly do we have, Vanessa? She faltered, her script suddenly failing her. And then everything happened at once. Vanessa lunged toward Jackson, but Catherine stepped between them. Vanessa collided with her grandmother instead, the force of her movement sending her stumbling backward, right into the doorway of the lounge. The door was open. The reception was still ongoing, and a crowd had gathered, drawn by the raised voices and drama. They had a perfect view of Vanessa, disheveled, desperate, nothing like the composed bride who had walked down the aisle an hour earlier. Vanessa froze, suddenly aware of the audience. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally, a defender. For the first time, she found none. You all think you're better than me, she said, her voice cracking. Just wait. None of you will be anything without me. No one responded. No one rushed to contradict her. I stepped forward, not out of malice, but because I needed her to hear this. Vanessa, I said, my voice steady. You spent your whole engagement making sure Jackson couldn't see who you really are. I gestured to the onlookers. But look around. Everyone sees you now. Her face contorted, a flash of raw emotion before she smoothed it away. Without another word, she pushed through the crowd and disappeared. In her wake, the room fell silent. Jackson stood motionless by the window, shock evident in every line of his body. Eleanor had sunk into a chair, her perfect posture abandoned. Calvin stared after Vanessa, his expression unreadable. And me? I felt nothing but exhaustion. I had spent so many years trying to belong in this family, and now I wasn't sure I wanted to. I turned and walked away, not dramatically, not defiantly, just a quiet, final decision to leave a room where I had never truly been welcome. The night air was cool against my face as I stepped onto the hotel's terrace. Boston spread out before me, a tapestry of lights against the darkness. I leaned against the railing, breathing in the scent of the harbor in the distance. Room for one more? I turned to find Catherine Pierce beside me, 2 glasses of whiskey in her hands. She offered one to me, and I accepted it with a nod of thanks. "Quite a wedding," she said, taking a sip of her drink. I laughed despite myself. Not exactly what they had planned. Plans rarely survive contact with reality. She studied me over the rim of her glass. "You know, Mr. Morgan, you surprise me." "How so?" "You defended a brother who has, from what I've observed, never defended you." The observation was so direct, so accurate, that it took me a moment to respond. "He's still my brother." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. Blood is a powerful tie, even when it's not literal. We stood in silence for a moment, the distant sounds of the city washing over us. "What happens now?" I finally asked, not sure if I was asking about the wedding, the family, or something larger. "Now," Catherine smiled slightly. "Now the interesting part begins." "The interesting part?" "What happens after the facade cracks? Will they rebuild the same walls, or will they build something new, something real?" She turned to face me fully. "The Morgans have spent generations crafting their image, Mr. Morgan. But images don't keep you warm at night." Before I could respond, the terrace door opened behind us. Jackson stood there, his tie loose, his perfect hair finally showing signs of disarray. "Ethan," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Can we talk?" Catherine raised an eyebrow at me, then quietly excused herself, leaving us alone. Jackson approached the railing, mirroring my posture as he looked out over the city. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "You knew," he finally said. "About Vanessa. You tried to tell me months ago." I had. A casual comment about her interest in the family finances, an observation about how her demeanor changed when we were alone. He dismissed me, told me I was jealous, paranoid. "It doesn't matter now," I said. "It does," he insisted. "You saw what I didn't want to see." I turned to look at him, really look at him, perhaps for the first time in years. Despite being only 2 years older than me, Jackson had always seemed decades more mature, more polished, more Morgan. Now in the dim light of the terrace, I could see the cracks in that polish, the uncertainty, the vulnerability. "Why table 24? I asked, the question that had started this whole evening suddenly rising to my lips. Jackson looked away, shame flickering across his features. "Vanessa suggested it. Said it would be better for photos, for the family narrative." He swallowed hard. "And I went along with it because it was easier than fighting." "Easier than standing up for me, you mean?" "Yes." The admission seemed to cost him something. "I've never been very good at that, have I?" "No," I agreed. The simple truth, both painful and somehow freeing to acknowledge. "You haven't." Jackson nodded slowly. "I don't think any of us have been very good at being a family." The statement hung between us, honest in a way the Morgans rarely were. "What happens now?" I asked, echoing my earlier question to Catherine. Jackson took a deep breath. "I don't know. I don't think I know anything anymore." For the first time in our relationship, I saw my brother without the filter of perfection, without the mantle of the golden child. Just a man, as lost and uncertain as anyone else. "I do know one thing," he added after a moment. "I'm sorry, Ethan. For table 24. For all of it. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough to make up for years of exclusion, of subtle and not so subtle messaging that I wasn't quite a Morgan. Not really. But it was a start. "Thank you," I said simply. We stood in silence for a while longer. Two brothers who had never really known how to be brothers, looking out at the city that had shaped us both. In the days that followed, the wedding that wasn't dominated Boston's social circles. The official story was that Jackson and Vanessa had mutually decided to postpone their nuptials, a polite fiction that fooled no one but preserved what dignity remained. I returned to my small apartment in Cambridge, to my job at the bookstore, to the life I had built outside the Morgan sphere of influence. I expected things to return to normal, occasional forced family dinners, perfunctory holiday gatherings, the careful dance of belonging without belonging. But something had shifted. The first sign came in the form of a text from Jackson, asking if I wanted to grab coffee. Not at the family home, not at some exclusive club where the Morgan name opened doors, but at a small cafe near my apartment. We talked for hours that day, awkwardly at first, then with increasing honesty. He asked about my life, really asked, not the polite inquiries that expected only positive, surface-level responses. I told him about my writing, the novel I'd been working on in secret, the life I'd imagined for myself that had nothing to do with law firms or family foundations. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. "Would you have listened?" He didn't answer, which was answer enough. A week later, Eleanor called. Her voice was different, hesitant, almost uncertain. "Ethan," she said, "I'd like to have dinner. Just the two of us." The dinner was uncomfortable, filled with long silences and halting attempts at connection. Eleanor had never known how to talk to me. Not really. She had adopted a cousin's child out of duty, raised him out of obligation, but never quite figured out how to love him. "I kept your mother's letters," she said abruptly, as dessert was served. "Your biological mother, Diane. She wrote to me after you were born, before the accident." I set down my fork, shock rippling through me. "You never told me. I thought it would be better." Eleanor's gaze dropped to her plate. "Cleaner, if you just became Morgan." "But I never did I?" "Not really." She flinched slightly, the truth of it undeniable. "No," she admitted. "I never let you." It wasn't a tearful reconciliation. There were no dramatic embraces or profound declarations of love. But it was honest, perhaps the first honest conversation we'd ever had. As I walked her to her car afterward, she paused. "The letters," she said. "Would you like to have them?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "I'll have them sent to your apartment," she promised. Then, awkwardly, she reached out and squeezed my arm, the closest thing to physical affection she had offered me in years. The final shift came from Calvin, in his own way. He invited me to lunch at his club, a space I had visited only on the rarest of occasions when absolutely required. We sat across from each other, two men who shared a name but little else. "I've been reading your work," he said, surprising me. "My work?" "Your writing." He gestured vaguely. Jackson mentioned it. I asked him to send me what he had. I stared at him, trying to process this information. "And it's good," he said simply. "Better than good. You have talent." Coming from Calvin, this was equivalent to effusive praise. "Thank you," I said cautiously. He nodded once, then shifted gears entirely to discuss a legal case he was working on. It was brief, awkward, and entirely characteristic of Calvin Morgan III. But he had made an effort, however small, to see me as I was, not as he had always assumed I should be. 6 months after the wedding that wasn't, I sat in my apartment, surrounded by pages of my manuscript. My phone buzzed with a text from Jackson, confirming dinner plans for the weekend. On my bookshelf sat a small wooden box containing letters from a mother I barely remembered, each one a piece of a history I was only now discovering. The Morgans were still the Morgans, still concerned with appearances, still conscious of their place in Boston society. Eleanor still fretted about what people would say. Calvin still worked too much. Jackson still struggled to step out of the path that had been laid for him since birth. But there were cracks in the facade now, spaces where light could get in. We were learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to be a family based on more than obligation and appearances. As for me, I was learning that belonging isn't about forcing yourself into spaces that were never built for you. Sometimes it's about finding the courage to create your own space, to define family on your own terms. Sometimes walking away is the first step toward finding where you truly belong. The Morgan name would always be part of me, but it no longer defined me. And in that space between belonging and not belonging, I had finally found freedom. 3 weeks later, I received a call from a publishing house expressing interest in my manuscript. The editor's name was unfamiliar, but I later learned that Catherine Pierce had sent my work to a friend in publishing. Talent should be nurtured, she told me when I called to thank her, regardless of what name is on the cover. My book would be published under my full name, Ethan Whitley Morgan, a name that honored where I came from, all of it, while creating something entirely my own. In the end, I learned that family isn't about blood or adoption papers or even shared history. It's about respect. It's about seeing people for who they really are, not who you need them to be. It's about building connections that nourish rather than deplete, that lift up rather than diminish. The Morgans were still learning this lesson, in their own halting way. As for me, I was done waiting for a seat at their table. I was building my own. The end.